live online webinar of Scientists Rebellion Turtle Island. My name is Bernadette Rogers. I am a part of Scientists Rebellion Turtle Island on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest region. And we have a very special presentation today by Dr. Fernando Racimo, who is a part of SR Denmark, Scientists Rebellion Denmark. For those of you that may be new to Scientists Rebellion or Scientists Rebellion Turtle Island, we are a regional group. Scientists Rebellion Turtle Island is a regional group of the global organization Scientists Rebellion, and we represent English-speaking North America, so that is the United States and Canada. Excuse me, Canada. We are a multidisciplinary group of scientists and academics and science-loving activists united by our determination to address the climate and the biosphere crises we face. Scientists Rebellion believes, as I'm sure Fernando will discuss, that scientists and scholars should be at the forefront of the climate struggle. We feel strongly that those of us best positioned to understand these existential crises, if we are not acting like it is an emergency, how can we expect the general public to do so? So we speak out, we disrupt, we partake in nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action, and we are trying to sound the alarm to push for climate justice and ensure a livable and more equitable future for generations to come. If you are a scientist, an academic, or just someone who believes that more scientists need to step forward in the climate movement, you can also be part of Scientists Rebellion. And to visit Scientists Rebellion Turtle Island, please look for us at srturtleisland.org online. We would love to have you join us. Today, as I said, we're thrilled to have Dr. Fernando Racimo with us to talk about Scientists Rebellion, in fact. And Fernando is an associate professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. But Fernando also studied in the United States. He has an undergrad degree from Harvard and a PhD from UC Berkeley. He is also a founding member of Scientists Rebellion Denmark. So he's been very active in the movement in Europe. He's published several very helpful articles that you can find online, Racimo et al. And now those articles are about Scientists Rebellion and about the need for academic activism in general. But now he has published a book, which is called Science in Resistance, The Scientist Rebellion for Climate Justice. This is a book which he'll be talking about today. Of course, he's currently on a European book tour, traveling only by train, and joining us today virtually as part of that tour. The book, I guess I'm not going to read the whole blurb about the book because he's going to tell us about it, but basically it talks about his own experience in the Scientists Rebellion movement and combines personal stories, interviews with frontline activists, insights from research on direct action in academia, and how we can challenge scientists to really take a stand for climate and social justice. So the book, again, is called Science in Resistance. It's available from whatever independent bookseller you get your books from. I'll put a link in the chat. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Fernando. And I want to say thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bernadette, and to SR Turtle Island for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be talking to you. As you said, I spent a good chunk of my life in Turtle Island, so it's nice to connect with scientist activists across the Atlantic. So like Bernadette said, my name is Fernando. My pronouns are he, him. I'm originally from the settler state of Argentina. And after studying in the US, I eventually moved to Denmark, where I'm an associate professor there. And I've been a member of SR Denmark for about 5 years now. And the reason why I wrote this book, well, there's actually several reasons why I wrote this book. One of them is I wanted to document the origins and the evolution of this movement that I was a part of. But beyond the particular movement, I really wanted to get into the emotions, the feelings, the rationales that go through the mind of scientists as they engage in activism, as they join social movements for transformative change. I also wanted to evince some of the tensions that have emerged within the movement and how scientists activists are striving to resolve them, how the movement is evolving and where it could go moving forwards. I wanted to take a critical eye at the institution from which scientists activists emerge. So academia, universities, museums, research centers, and how this institution is very much complicit in fossil capitalism and fossil colonialism. And thinking critically also about how it could be transformed to be supportive of socio-ecological transformation. I also wanted to tell a little bit of my own story, how scientist activism changed me as both an academic and as an activist, and how I evolved over time. So there's snippets of personal experiences in activism in the book. But the book is not just about me. I interviewed 24 scientist activists from around the world, some of them in the front line, some of them doing more structural work, some of them even doing research on activism, as they practice activism. So it's also a lot of testimonies from these different scientist activists. But beyond these very academic reasons as to why I wrote the book, ultimately I wrote the book because doing science today, especially doing natural sciences, is a little bit batshit crazy. We're studying a world that is actively being killed, and our response to that is we're just going to study it some more, and then we're going to study it some more. Sometimes we're going to ask those who are doing the killing to pretty please stop. Sometimes we're going to ask them for money so we can continue studying the killing. So this is a bit of a contradiction that increasingly a lot of scientists and academics are feeling, are coming to terms with, even those who are not part of social movements. But I mean, and it's been sort of explored somewhat, like this double reality of academia. There's a good paper by our Arentierian colleagues about this, how we were able to sort of rationalize that we are in deep trouble. We're in multiple crises: climate, societal breakdown, rising fascism. But at the same time, we're not able to sort of emotionally process that also with our colleagues in our coffee conversations. But I do think that joining social movements, becoming part of social movements like Scientist Rebellion, but many other social movements out there that are pushing for change, is a good antidote to this sort of state of double reality. And so that's why I wanted to sort of give an overview of what it means for scientists to join these movements, and also to encourage more scientists, more academics, and more people in general to join social movements. So the book starts. I should say. Let me see if I can move yeah. So the book starts from some testimonies from some of the people that originally were starting this movement. One of them is Tim Hewlett, who was one of the first people that started Science Rebellion in London. And one of his theses is that, I'm just going to read, the truth is that the fossil fuel capitalism can only exist with the tacit or explicit support of scientists or of academia. Academia is a fracture point, a place of weakness you can target to help bring the system to end sooner rather than later. And one can see this in multiple ways. We can see this very explicitly in how fossil fuel and other extractivist companies are trying to pump money into universities. Now also AI companies, like techno-fascist corporations, are also trying to do this as well, because universities are centers of power and knowledge, and what happens in universities matters to the rest of society. And just an example here of UK universities with taking £40 million just in 2022 from fossil fuel funding. Also, the institutions that scientists interact with, not just universities, but publishing companies, are also highly complicit. They're also pillars of the fossil economy. Elsevier, a very well-known publishing corporation, has all these backroom deals with the fossil fuel industry. They run conferences for fossil fuel companies. They develop tools for oil exploration. Their parent company, Relics, they fund climate denialist politicians in the US. And I also talked to one of the people that works for the company. Eventually got fired for digging into the fossil fuel dealings of this particular company. And we also see this in the science policy bridge, or lack thereof. Scientist Rebellion, one of the most famous things that the movement did was leak one of the IPCC reports before it had a chance to be edited by politicians. This was, I think, the sixth assessment report that was leaked by Scientist Rebellion. And when one compares the leaked report with the edited report, one can see that sort of state representatives removed a lot of things related to the emissions of the ultra rich, things like private jets and yachts. Also removed the need to phase out coal and gas as fast as possible. And added a bunch of things like carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, all these narratives that fossil fuel industry likes to push, these sort of bullshit narratives that like keep us distracted, right? And so we know this, right? A lot of us know this, and that's why a lot of the movements, like in 2018, 2019, were pushing for transformative change. We're flooding the streets, Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Future. We know that the fossil fuel industry needs to go. But at the same time as these movements were emerging, one of the things that was happening was that even though all of the information, all the reports, the scientific papers that have been produced by scientists calling for the fossil fuel phase out, calling for, acknowledging that we're in climate trouble, in climate breakdown, or in deep trouble. At the same time, in this initial mobilization, so 2018, 2019 of the global climate movement after sort of Greta's acts of rebellion, scientists were shining for their absence. And some of the academics, some of the scientists were calling out the rest of the community. One of them is Charlie Gardner, who's depicted here in one of the major XR events in Piccadilly Circus. And it was sort of a stark contradiction, again, like sort of scientists producing all this information, but not being there shoulder to shoulder with them. And Charlie, together with another scientist, Claire Wardley, they published this paper sort of arguing that scientists should be parts of these social movements that are pushing for change, that we should be shoulder to shoulder with people. All these like grandmas are here, all these architects are here, all these lawyers are here. Where are the scientists? Eventually, this person that I mentioned, Tim Hewlett and Mike Lynch White, sort of take this to task. At this point, this is in 2020, a group had emerged in the UK called Scientists for XR, where scientists listening to Charlie's and other scientists' calls, were joining XR protests in their role as scientists or wearing like their lab coats. But at the time, this group they weren't featuring scientists getting arrested, and so the argument that these two scientists that I'm depicting in this photo had, Mike Lynch White and Tim Hewlett, was that scientists should also be taking on the riskier roles that the movements like XR. Some members of movements like XR are taking, that we should be putting scientists in positions of arrest, because it's sort of like saying you're like saying that there's a huge alarm, but then you go back to your office and you drink a cup of tea, and that's not very believable. So what they did is they went to one of the most prestigious institutions in the scientific world, the Royal Society of London. Very prestigious, very well regarded by the scientific community, at the same time very complicit in British imperialism historically. And they threw paint at the columns of this institution. They posted this letter on the door arguing that scientists should embody the truth that they are producing through their papers. And this was addressed principally at the Royal Society, but more broadly at academia in general. And they should be joining social movements. They should be engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience and indirect action. At the time, these two people, they both chained themselves to the stairs. They both got arrested. They spent the night in jail, as did the two people that were taking photographs of them for unclear reasons. And this prompted other people to start maybe trying to replicate what they had done. They also reached out to a lot of people. One of the nice things about scientists is that our emails are very readily available in our websites. We're very well internationally connected, so it's easy to spam us. Again, I'm reading from my interview with Tim. He says, early on, we used social media and email. We scraped the email lists of well over 100,000 academics around the world so we could spam them and tell them, this is what we've done. Do you want to be involved? A lot of people were angry at us for spamming them, of course, but some were curious. We started having multiple introduction sessions weekly, talking about scientist activism. And once you have a small dedicated team of 2 or 3 people in the local area, you can do anything. So people started listening, and eventually sort of subgroups of scientist rebellion started emerging in different countries. By early 2021, there's enough scientists that Scientists Rebellion can carry out its first sort of international wave of actions. So there's actions simultaneously in France, in Switzerland, in in Germany, in the UK, in Djibouti. There's also a scientist that goes on a hunger strike. People here at this point, they're starting to do this thing where they were pasting scientific papers on the walls of corporations or state institutions, sort of arguing that, like, it's not just enough to publish the paper, like we're trying to shove it in your face because you're obviously not listening to the science. In the UK, Mike Lynch White, together with Charlie Gardner, they go to the media headquarters of Rupert Murdoch's media empire, and they also paste scientific papers. They throw paint, arguing also that the media is highly complicit in climate breakdown. The way this is reported is not nearly good enough. And Mike Lynch White, a few days later, he also visits the residence of the British Prime Minister and chains himself to the gates of the Prime Minister's residency. Early on, scientists start targeting scientific institutions around 2021, 2022. There's very high profile actions, including one in Turtle Island, where Peter Kalmus and Rose Abramoff interrupt the biggest geophysical and geological conference, I think, in the world, if not in the US, the American Geophysical Union. They interrupt this speech for 32 seconds, what is one of the plenary events, arguing, that scientists should be out of the lab and into the streets. And even though the interruption is well received by the audience, after these 32 seconds, they get removed from the stage. Their badges are taken off. They're removed from the program. And a few weeks later, Rose Abramoff is fired from her job. In France, there's also an action targeting this very iconic Museum of Natural History in Paris, the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle. Again, scientists in the role of scientists wearing lab coats, visiting this museum, occupying the museum, in this case, giving talks on the topic of extinction. Like, we're living through the sixth mass extinction, with a banner that says, "To tell the truth is not a crime." Some of the scientists are chaining to the legs of this mammoth skeleton. It's also an action that is very, very widely reported by the media. A lot of the scientists from this action are still going through the legal process of this. They're also targeting, scientists were also targeting in the UK, the offices of Springer Nature, and calling out their complicity in fossil capitalism. Eventually, by 2021, late 2021, the sort of the spirit of rebellion reaches the country where I work, in Denmark. A little bit of context: in Denmark, the government had just passed its first climate law. This was something that was seen by academia and in general by the climate movement as a very positive development. It committed the government to reduce its domestic emissions. It didn't say anything about its transport or its consumption emissions, but it was something that the government could be held accountable for. But a few months after this law was passed, and the government had to explain how they were actually going to implement the law, what the government started to say was that they were not going to actually do much through most of the duration of the term of the law, which was 10 years, during the time they had to reduce their emissions, and then they were going to do a lot towards the end. So it was kind of this hockey stick plan of how they were going to carry out what the law dictated. And it was also a way to just say, we're not going to do anything, and maybe pass on the onus of decarbonizing to some later government. They were also arguing that a lot of the work that they were going to do was about sort of investing in these imaginary technologies, a lot of investments in carbon capture and storage. And so scientists, when they heard this, a lot of scientists were really pissed. They realized that the government is not planning to actually live up to the law that has just been passed. So together with several scientists, we decided to carry out a teach-in at the Climate Ministry, which is depicted here. A teach-in is this tactic that has been pursued by many social movements before the emergence of SR, by the peace movement, civil rights movements, many anti-colonial movements, where academics or scientists, they give a lecture in an unusual place on a topic that is of critical importance to the situation at the time. And so what we did is we went to the Climate Ministry and we set up this classroom of folding chairs in the middle of the roads. We were blocking the road while we were there was a lecture going on, so we had 11 lecturers and professors giving talks about climate change from different angles: sociology, political science, climate science, and ecology. And this was very covered by Danish media, from very far right newspapers to like very left wing newspapers, academic newspapers, and a lot of mainstream media as well. Um, and a few months later, we came back to this ministry. This was at the time of the publication of the sixth assessment report, and we were reading the words of the report on a megaphone while holding scientific papers and also blocking the road. But at this point, this is April 2022, Scientist Rebellion is big enough that they have chapters in, I think, about 26 different countries. So while we're doing this, there's also an action in Spain where over 40 scientists are throwing beetroot juice at the steps of the Spanish parliament, calling for climate action. In the US, Rose Abramoff chains herself to the White House fence, calling for Biden to declare a climate emergency. In LA, several scientists, some of which might be in this call, chained themselves to Chase Bank, which is one of the major fossil fuel financiers in the US. Um, in Germany, several scientists block one of the main bridges that lead to the Reichstag. In UK, scientists throw ink and block the main headquarters of Shell in London. In the Netherlands and Italy, there's blockades and occupations of fossil fuel companies. In Sweden, there's protests and there's another teach-in. In Norway, there's a strike by scientists. In Nigeria, Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo, there's multiple protests in various universities. In Ecuador, scientists carry out an action in front of the Ecuadorian Environment Ministry, and in my own country, in Argentina, there's also another teaching in Buenos Aires. And this tactic is something that the movement pursues repeatedly over the next few years. Partly because it's a way of amplifying each individual action, so making a national event into an international event. It's also because you can't get enough scientists to block Piccadilly Circus, but you can get enough scientists in different countries to do things simultaneously, and that sort of amplifies each individual action. It also makes each individual group a little bit brave because they see other people organizing something incredible somewhere else, and they think, well, maybe we can do something like that. And this is something that the founders of SR were telling me was part of the motivation for pursuing this tactic. So in October 2022, there's another wave of international actions. This one is particularly focused in Germany in the transport emissions. So it's calling for affordable public transport in Germany, decarbonizing the transport sector in Germany, and also targeting the car companies, the car lobby that was trying to make this transport laws, basically trying to make it very difficult for politicians to maintain affordable public transport in Germany. So there's occupations of car pavilions, protests at the transport ministry in Germany, and also simultaneously solidarity actions around the world. In May 2023, there's another wave of scientist actions internationally, as there is as well in November 2023. Beyond amplifying struggles, doing simultaneous actions allows one to connect struggles. A lot of these fossil fuel atrocities involve multiple countries. One example of an atrocity is the ECO pipeline, this pipeline that is being built by the French company Total and several Chinese companies, which is supposed to pump oil from Lake Albert in Uganda and through the port of Tanga in Tanzania, exported to East Asian and European markets. While this pipeline is being built, entire communities are being displaced, ecosystems are being polluted. It has been called out by multiple NGOs as a complete atrocity. But what one can do is there's multiple SR groups that can protest around the same topic, not just in Uganda and Tanzania, but also in neighboring Rwanda and Kenya. And as one of the activists that I interviewed, Shami from SR Rwanda, tells me, this actually helps a lot with amplifying the action. So he says, when we do these actions internationally and the narrative and demands are the same, local politicians are surprised at the amount of attention we get. Many people will bump into our actions online, and that amplification helps to spread the message farther and much faster. And of course, the atrocity doesn't just involve those countries. It's sort of internationally financed, it's internationally supported. So one can also target the sites of the capital centers, as well as the financing centers in Europe, in South Africa, in East Asia, and in Turtle Island. Okay, that's as much as I want to say about sort of the historical overview. As I mentioned, the book is quite a lot about the emotions that go through scientists as they engage in action. One of the things that happens as scientists start to engage in action is that they, of course, receive resistance from colleagues, from people above them, from people close to them. And I also try to go through the arguments that are given at scientists to try to encourage pacifism and disengagement in sort of societal struggles. One of the most popular ones is this argument of scientific neutrality, that scientists should somehow be neutral, that some such a thing as scientific neutrality actually exists. It's not just whatever the status quo, is right now, December 16 at 9:30 p.m. CET. And this has been criticized by multiple fields of scholarship, feminist scholarship, sort of calling out this idea as sort of being completely bogus because scientists are all, and any knowledge seeker, they're always embedded in some social, political milieu that influences what they do, and any act of knowledge extraction involves some sort of damage on the world. And it's also been criticized by anti-colonial and indigenous scholars as really representing this idea, sort of a universalizing position that is really just the position of the Western white man. So these arguments have been very much tackled by many fields of scholarship, and I try to explore these different arguments in the book. There's also the argument about credibility, that scientists lose credibility if they engage in social movements. But that one has also been quite debunked by a lot of social science, that a lot of studies showing that actually the credibility of scientists increases as they engage in social movements and in critical problems of their time. That's also been my own personal experience. Like, people ask me more about these things, or they go to me more when they see that I'm engaged. But beyond these sort of very rational arguments for scientific pacifism, there's also, and I argue in the book, there's also something deeper that prevents more scientists from engaging in social movements, that has to do with the structures of academia. And this is put very well by Charlie Gardner in one of my interviews. So I'm just going to read his quote. He says, "The rationales we tend to hear from scientists themselves are not necessarily the true reasons why they're not joining movements. It sounds a bit selfish and self-centered and perhaps self-promoting to say, I don't want to get involved in activism because I need to focus on high-impact papers. So you can't say that and you can't admit it to yourself, and you come up with other reasons to allow you to excuse yourself. It's no surprise we want to stay on our chosen paths. Many of us have had this ambition since we were young. It can be almost our sense of identity. I'm a scientist. I've always imagined a future of being a respected professor. And in academia, the people that rise to the top usually share one characteristic. They're able to say no to distractions and focus on the things that are going to get them to the top. So, of course, your brain is going to play tricks on you to defend that dream, and it does so in all sorts of ways. And so what I think Charlie's getting at here is that there's sort of these deeper structures in academia that prevent societal engagement by scientists. And so I explore those structures in the next chapter after this quote. And that chapter has a lot to do with the regime of academic capitalism, this way in which universities over the last 4 to 5 decades, they've been plugged into systems of profit making and extraction, in many ways conceptualized as sort of places of hyper competition, a proliferation of metrics on which subjects are on which scientists are evaluated, and also a proliferation of managerial logic. So people above telling people below what to do, rather than people collectively deciding how academia runs. And all of these things sort of together prevent scientists from engaging in social movements. And in that chapter, I also go, I explore this idea through the lens of three scientist activists who are young scholars, they're early career scientists, and they encounter barriers as they try to engage in activism. So this is the part where I'm gonna read a couple of pages from the book, because it's a book, so I thought maybe I should do a little bit of reading from it. And it's a chapter that it's the beginning of this chapter, and it's particularly focusing on one person, a person called Lu, who's a very classic climate scientist. She studies glaciers for a living, so she studies glacier decline, but she's also an activist. And I follow her as she engages in activism, but also as she confronts her activism in the lab. Lu studies glaciers for a living. More specifically, she studies the invisible organisms that live on top of them. Microscopically tiny algae and bacteria manage to survive, even thrive, on the surface of the ice. For her, these organisms are particularly fascinating because they can color the natural whiteness of glaciers, decreasing their capacity to reflect light from the sun. She is pursuing a PhD to understand how these little creatures can contribute to glacial melting, which is a crucial component of our climate system. Her research takes her to some of the most majestic landscapes in the planet, realms of pristine snow and frozen crystals far up north in Greenland and Norway. She collects her measurements while camping on the ice in the summer season. At her campsites, she wakes up and goes to sleep under the constant presence of the sun, which never sets at that time of the year. But these landscapes are dying fast. Many of the glaciers Lou has visited will disappear within her lifetime. She tells me, quote, "It's difficult to just look at a glacier and know that it will not be there within a few decades, knowing that so many creatures that depend on the ice will also disappear. It fills me with sadness, but also anger because of the injustice of it all. The natural world is going through changes that it didn't ask for, affecting our climate and all existing beings. The disappearance of snow and ice means the extinction of species, as well as the extinction of very ancient cultural heritages in the Arctic." End quote. Today, Lou is not on the ice. She is instead harnessing her anger into something else, taking a break from her research on glaciers to go face the costs of their impending death. She has traveled south to central Germany. It is January 14, 2023. The tiny German village of Lützerath, nicknamed Lützi, is today one of the main sites of resistance against the advance of the fossil fuel machine in Europe. Lützi sits right on the border of an open lignite coal mine, hundreds of hectares in size. The multinational energy company RWE means to destroy the village so they can expand the mine even further. For months now, Lützi has been occupied by hundreds of activists, locking onto buildings and trees to resist the expansion of the megamine. Their motto is Lützi bleibt, Lützi stays. They don't just want to preserve the village, they want RWE to keep the coal in the ground. Lignite coal is the most polluting of all fossil fuels due to its low heat content. At just 17 megajoules per kilogram, it is half as efficient as coal from bitumen, so one needs to burn a lot more of it to obtain the same amount of energy. Over the past week, RWE and police in riot gear have moved to forcefully evict the activists who still refuse to leave. Giant bulldozers have entered the village and are working day and night to destroy the town buildings. As a Scientist Rebellion member, Lou is joining about 35,000 people who are now surrounding the town in a last stand to retake it. She watches in disbelief the desolation all around her, kilometers and kilometers of barren soil which end just at the town's limits. Once dense forests and farmland, the entire landscape has turned into a monochrome beige basin, all dug up using giant bucket wheel excavators, over 14,000 tons of metal, the largest machines in existence, designed to destroy anything in their path. Quote, "It's heavy seeing these huge machines digging and taking so much from the land. The sound, the visuals, the evil is really there in front of your eyes." End quote. Though Lou and the other activists try to re-enter the village, they ultimately fail to save it. Hundreds of heavily armored police agents encircle Lützi, enabling RWE's machines to continue their work. The bulldozers clear the last vestiges of the buildings, and the excavators move to dig the ground underneath. Writer Peter Gelderlos compares this type of mine landscape to Tolkien's Mordor, a vast wasteland as far as the eye can see, where nothing is alive. As Lützi vanishes into rubble, the wasteland looms ever larger, the machines encroaching on everything and everyone along their path. And this photo is actually a photo that Lou took while she was there. In her dual role as nature observer and nature defender, Lou is a rare case in academia. She has seen firsthand both the causes and the consequences of climate change, but she does not feel it is enough to just see. She also feels compelled to act. Her analysis on glacier decline is complemented by her fight against the companies that are causing it. A few days after her stay in Lützi, Lou comes back to her lab, but something deep inside her has changed. It feels wrong to just continue doing science as usual, knowing the fossil machine is still out there, still advancing. She feels a stark contradiction between her two identities, the scientist and the activist. Quote, "I increasingly think that academia in its current form is part of the problem. Even if we don't produce money or goods en masse, we're still part of the same machine, consuming tons of resources to produce manuscripts, papers, and reports without really thinking whether the knowledge we're creating is even being used properly. It all serves to keep the gears of capitalism moving, the same gears I was trying to escape from when I first decided to become a scientist. End quote. Sitting with her for a chat, I asked Lou if she talks about her activism to other members of her lab. After all, one would think that a research group specializing in climate change and glacier collapse would be buzzing with conversations about Lou's experiences in Lutzi. That could not be farther from the truth. Quote, even though we work directly on the effects of climate change, there's no discussion about climate activism or climate politics in our research group. It's very difficult to even start a conversation about these topics. You can't really talk about it, there's no culture of discussion about this in my field, and it is especially difficult if you're an early career scientist. End quote. What are the reasons that make it so difficult for Lou as well as other scientists to open up about this activism? How did academia become an environment in which even talking about activism is frowned upon? And how are scientists activists navigating and challenging this environment? So as I said, the rest of the chapter is about sort of exploring academic structures and how they prevent change. But one of the things that emerges from Lou's testimony, but also other testimonies of other scientist activists engaging in activism, is that a lot of the activism they do comes back to their lab. And so they end up changing their research practices as a consequence of experiences that they live on the streets or in places like Lutzi. In the case of Lou, for example, she reflects on her own research in Greenland, and so in a later chapter, I go back to her, and she tells me that she completely changed her research project. She defied her own PI, and she's now no longer doing research in Greenland. So again, reading from her quote, she says, "It's a weird thing to be jumping between planes and helicopters, emitting huge amounts of carbon emissions just to transfer us and the 5 tons of food we need to be there in Greenland to study how a glacier is dying. The second year I was there, our solar panels stopped working and we had to use diesel generators. I woke up every day and saw these dark fumes pumped into this pure crystal environment. It was very dystopian. And the generators kept breaking, so we had to have a helicopter come every 5 days to bring a new generator. 2 years into my PhD, I wanted to do things differently. After the second expedition to Greenland, the cognitive dissonance related to the carbon cost and colonial legacy of my research struck me. Sitting with my internal contradictions impacted me more than I thought, and I wanted to channel these negative emotions into something else. A colleague of mine and I decided to develop a new research project on a glacier in Norway. We're based in Denmark, so we took the bus to Oslo and then a train to the northern town of Finse, home to one of the largest glaciers in Norway. It was more laborious work. There were no planes, no cars, no helicopter to carry our stuff. We had to do everything ourselves. But it was also a much more grounded experience. We could try to understand what was happening to this glacier with a lot more humility than how we had behaved in Greenland. After this, I learned that I don't want to hop on a helicopter ever again in my life. So this experiences of sort of trying to do the research more grounded is something that emerges a lot in the book. There's also the very famous example of Gianluca Grimalda, this social psychologist who studies communities being affected by climate change in Papua New Guinea, but is based in Germany. And he refuses to take a plane to go to his site, so he has to take buses and trains and ferries to get to Papua New Guinea over several months. And he eventually gets fired as a consequence of this, and this is a very, very well publicized event. But also another reason why scientist activists sort of end up being more grounded in the sort of the communities and the environments in which they're in has to do with also engaging in dialogue with engaging in dialogue with activists and movements, especially in the global south. I interviewed several scientist activists who are working in various countries in the global south, in Panama, in Rwanda, in Uganda, in the Republic of Congo, as well as in Ecuador. So in the picture here, this is Jordan Cruz, who's a scientist activist in SR Ecuador. And he was part of these huge mobilizations a few years ago, not just made up of scientists, but also involving a lot of worker movements, student movements, and also indigenous movements to end oil exploitation in a tropical rainforest called the Yasuni. The Yasuni is this very lush tropical forest, has more like frogs and toads than more species of frogs and toads than the entirety of the US and Canada. But underneath the Yasuni, there's a ton of oil, so this has been exploited for the last at least 3 decades, I think more than 3 decades, by Chevron and also several after Chevron, the state oil corporation in Ecuador. But through these huge mobilizations that were largely led by indigenous groups like the Waorani, who actually live in the park. And this the picture in the picture talking to Jordan is a Waorani leader, Alicia Kauya, who was also one of the main mobilizers for these protests. That led eventually, it forced the government to push for a referendum on oil exploitation in the Yasuni, and over 60% of the Ecuadorian people voted to end oil exploitation in the Yasuni, and this was a major victory for the climate justice movement. Um, and in my interview with Jordan, he especially tells me about how they conceptualize their activism and their participation in social movement while being respectful of indigenous practices, indigenous ways of knowing, and also all the work that indigenous groups have been doing for decades to resist oil and gas and coal for a much longer time than any of these sort of scientist activist movements. So he says, and I quote, in SR Ecuador, there is something that we've always said from the beginning. We did not invent ecological resistance. There is a much longer tradition of resistance here, mainly by indigenous communities. In Ecuador, 13% of the population are indigenous, and many more have indigenous ties. Indigenous resistance groups here are well organized and have been successfully fighting against extractivism for a long time. And of course, one way in which Scientist Rebellion tries to honor these indigenous struggles is by avoiding settler colonial names. I don't have to tell a lot of the people in this audience, but there is no SR USA, there's no SR Canada chapter, but there's an SR Turtle Island chapter to honor indigenous, avoiding settler colonial names. Also, the network of SR groups that stretches from Mexico all the way to Argentina is called SR Abiyala, again, honoring indigenous resistance. And so this is one way in which, as Jordan explains, scientist activist groups in the global south and in places where indigenous groups are active try to be respectful of indigenous struggles and collaborate with indigenous struggles. I'm getting towards the end. One of the things I should mention is, of course, repression. There's increasing repression for climate activism in Europe, in Turtle Island, in many places of the world. This is a picture from an action in Germany from a few years ago, targeting a speech that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was giving at the World Health Organization, selling himself as a climate chancellor while investing in tons of, subsidizing a ton of big coal companies. And here, a scientist activist is being applied these pain grips that are very common in Europe these days, that sort of make you want to stand up as they're arresting you. And there's increasing repression, not just through police violence, but also through legal processes, the lengthening of legal processes, a lot of uncertainty created by legal structures. At the same time, all of this is relative in some places of the world, in some places in the global south. Going to prison, sort of giving oneself up to the police and sort of this act of civil disobedience is not even something that one does. I mean, it's in some sense it involves a lot of white bodies that are assumed that are going to be treated well by the police, and that might not be the case in many places. So, for example, again, Shami from SR Uganda says, here, staying in prison for just a few days is enough punishment. The toilets, the conditions make people scared. Cholera is widespread, so they don't expect you to campaign again after an arrest. That way, the government handles resistance through repression. And of course, again, all of this is relative in some places in the world. Just even practicing one's own job, doing research or teaching, is an act of resistance. And to me, a very clear example of this is occupied Palestine, where every university has been destroyed through either bombing or controlled demolition. While academics and scientists continue to reproduce academia, they continue to teach to students even under these heavy conditions of genocide and colonial oppression. So that's something to keep in mind. The example of Palestine brings me back to Mike Lynch White, who's one of the founders of Scientist Rebellion, because he was one of the people that in Europe was put in jail for one of the longest periods in recent history in the UK. He was in jail for climate activism, actually for activism. And that was he was put in jail for 2 years, not for something that he did with Scientist Rebellion, but for something that he did with the Palestine Action Group, which was recently prescribed in the UK. So he famously, together with two other activists, was peacefully dismantling a weapons factory in Runcorn in the UK. For this, he spent 2 years close to 2 years in jail. So I interviewed him right after he came out of jail, and he reflected on his own experiences in activism, but also on the evolution of the SR movement. And while he appreciates a lot the SR movement, he also has a lot of sort of criticism for the movement in the sense that he argues that Scientist Rebellion has not focused enough on universities, on academia as a place of supporting fossil capitalism. So increasingly, it's sort of about scientists, coming out from the ivory tower to the streets and engaging in social movements on the streets. But as I said towards the beginning, there's a lot of stuff happening in universities that supports the fossil economy. And of course, it's much harder to confront one's own institution, like occupy one's own workplace, because of course, under capitalism, this is the place from which we get our salaries. So it's a much bigger ask to confront our own institutions than to just go to a street and do a protest. But this made me reflect, and so also towards the end of the book, I try to reflect on how could we sort of transform academia, what tactics and strategies could be pursued to transform academia so it's no longer sort of a pillar of the fossil economy, but it's actually a pillar of socio-ecological transformation that's actually serving the well-being of the human and more than human world and not extractivist companies. So, moving away from this model of academia, sort of serving profit-making institutions, away from the model of academia, sort of like guided by overproduction, just pushing out papers, so this model of publish or perish, moving away from academia, sort of artificial labor scarcity and the sort of the push for precariousness, and also moving away from this proliferation of metrics and managers, that's sort of this logic of infinite growth. So this model of academia as a bucket wheel excavator in itself. And a lot of people have written about this, how we could democratize and decolonize our academic systems to push them away from these extractivist logics. So I mean, I'm just putting a lot of references, a lot of inspirational papers here, a lot of inspirational books that talk about this, how we could transform academia. What would a democratic academia look like? There's really interesting, very exhaustive, exhaustive books about democratizing academia. There's this book by Jenny Stephens on climate justice in the university. There's a book on decolonizing the university by several decolonial scholars. I also talk about, together with several scholars in Denmark and Sweden, I talk about how we could degrow and decolonize academia. One recent paper I would really recommend is the one I'm putting in the top left here for democratic governance of universities. That is about administrative abolition, really abolishing university presidents and provosts and rectors, abolishing those positions, and bringing back democratic control of universities to faculty and staff and students, not just academics like teaching and research staff, but also all the people that make universities run, the cleaning stuff, the cooking stuff. And they argue that sort of this managerial class is kind of a parasitical group that was developed over time to extract value and labor from the people that actually make universities run. But this is all very theoretical, and I just want to kind of make it a little bit concrete. I mentioned there's this one wave of rebellion that I talked about that was highly focused on Germany. This was several scientist activists that were concentrated in Germany from different corners of Europe. And I was a part of this. And it was a lot of highly publicized actions that were appearing a lot in the media. But what I remember the most from this wave of actions, and this was like 2 continuous weeks of actions, one after the other, was not any of this stuff, which was being shown in the media, but what was happening in between the actions. Because while we were doing this, we also needed a place to rest, to recharge our energies. So after every action, before every action, we were gathering in this industrial warehouse in the south of Berlin. And this was a place in which we could meet with other scientist activists, talk about our experiences in activism, and get training from other people that were much more experienced than us. And so in this place, we were also like preparing the sticky glue mix based on wheat that we were using to paste scientific papers. We were making stencils together, but we were also attending lectures and seminars by other allied social movements like that for climate that were teaching us about sort of the many intersecting struggles that go beyond just climate justice, but social justice, anti-colonial justice. Some people, some scientists and academics have brought instruments, so they were playing these beautiful ballads during these breaks, these resting breaks. And there were also psychologists that were helping us process our emotions around climate and ecological anxiety. And all of this was organized very horizontal. There was no one person that was determining what we were doing. It was sort of based on anarchist principles of mutual aid and collective action. And it was really prefiguring how we could organize ourselves differently. The interesting thing to me is that all these people, these are academics and scientists, after this, we all go back to our different universities and research centers, like our little silos that are sort of these very managerially run institutions. But this shows that we could be running these places very differently if we organize ourselves good enough, well enough. And of course, this is not a new concept. You know, the idea of the horizontally running organizations has been existed for a long time. There's the example, for example, the climate camps. These camps that have existed in Europe and Turtle Island for several decades. They're horizontally run. They're run based on principles of mutual aid. There's a lot of sort of collective cooking and sharing of responsibilities, rotation of tasks. They usually are a prelude to these big actions, like these Ende Gelände actions that involve occupations of coal mines. But they're not the thing that you see when you look at sort of the media accounts of the action. Of course, practices of democratic deliberation and horizontal decision-making have also been parts of many other movements before the global climate movement, like, for example, the Occupy movement with these democratic assemblies on the street. And in my own country, in Argentina, the idea of sort of food sharing and food cooking as sort of part of protest, something you do collectively and communally, is a central aspect of many mobilizations, many protest mobilizations. And of course, the other, to me, typical example of this were the Palestine encampments, the student encampments in universities across the world, particularly in the global north, demanding that universities around the world stop supporting the occupation of Palestine, the genocide in Palestine, through investments, through partnerships. But to me, the very cool thing about these camps, beyond their demands, was the way in which they were run. They were, again, run very horizontally. People were rotating tasks. And they were doing a lot of academic things. They were showing documentaries. They were having lectures and classrooms about Palestine, teaching all these things that universities were failing to teach their students or failing to feature centrally, even though the genocide was ongoing at the time. And so in some way, this sort of idea of prefiguration, of showing people through our protests a different world, I think is super important. It's sort of, in this case, they were kind of universities within the university, and they were showing the university, look, we could be running things differently. We could be something else, but we're not. It sort of, I think, alerted a lot of people in universities around the world that, there's other universities that could exist, and we're preventing them from emerging. In Oxford, I remember there was this example, like in some of the campus, they had made like agroecological farms on campus, and then in some of these places, like Oxford, you had the bulldozer destroying the agroecological farm that the students had made themselves. And it's like a very powerful image of sort of managerialism trumping these alternative worlds that are out there. So I think we could replace this model of universities and research centers sort of serving capital accumulation by a different model that serves human and more than human well-being, based on principles of slow science and sufficiency, sort of borrowing from people like Isabel Stengers, but also from the degrowth movement or degrowth scholarship. Also, doing a lot of work, we need to do a lot of work with labor, with organized labor, with our unions, in order to ensure we have the secure means of subsistence to do all these things. A lot of a common theme throughout the book when I talk to activists is like people are scared. They're scared for their jobs. They don't have enough time. They fear that whatever they do, somebody above them is going to tell them that that's wrong, and that could lead to them being fired. I think we need to do a lot better at organizing ourselves as academics, as scientists, to protect and secure means of subsistence, especially in conditions of fascism, where fascist leaders might target particularly the managers at the very top, and threaten them with like sort of removal of funding. We need to ensure that it's not just those few people at the top that are making decisions about how a university is run. And of course, also looking at principles of economic democracy. This is something that is talked a lot in degrowth literature, like how we could be replacing corporations by cooperatives, by collectives, that organizations that are not driven by a profit motive, and that could also be the case in universities. But that would involve a lot of deliberation at a much more grassroots level of what we invest in, what a university budget looks like, that is not just determined by a few people at the top. Um, and again, this is not a hypothetical thing. There's a lot of universities that actually run this way. One example of this is the Ecoversities Alliance, this network of universities run differently in the service of their local communities, in the service of local ecologies. An example within the network is, for example, the Universidad de la Tierra, or Unitierra in Chiapas, which is a university run very horizontally, where people sometimes are students, sometimes they're teachers. There's no this like extreme managerialism. And these universities are in service of social movements that are operating in their local areas. In the case of Universidad de la Tierra, they're working very closely with the Zapatista movement in the autonomous region of Chiapas. I don't think I need to explain why we really need to be organizing ourselves better at an academic level. Again, in the increasing conditions of fascism, universities are places that are going to be targeted. They're already being targeted in places like Turtle Island. And we need to protect ourselves even as we try to build the worlds that we want to build. Okay, this is, I think, one of my last slides. I just want to make a few points about the future of movements, particularly Scientist Rebellion, but other movements, maybe climate justice movements, academic movements. Some of this is from the book. Some of this is from the book tour that I've been in. I just came back from visiting 11 different countries, giving talks like the one I just gave you. And I've been having a chance to talk to a lot of activists, a lot of people within academia and outside academia who are involved in activism. And so I have a few reflections about this. One of them is the point that I just made is, academia is also a terrain of struggle. We need to be pushing for academic democratization, decolonization, maybe focusing less on our identity as scientists and more on the fact that we are working on a place, academia, that involves other people beyond just scientists, students, staff, and maybe focusing a bit more of our movements on place rather than our particular identities, which are also the result of Western ways of thinking and acting. We, of course, need to strengthen and radicalize our unions. We need to ensure that people have secure and safe means of subsistence in order to actually engage in the things that they feel are important to them. We need to be better at connecting environmental and labor demands. A lot of the things that movements like Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion do has to do with direct action. But I think there's a lot of things that we need to be doing involving dialogue with unions, with labor. I was for example, in Catalonia, in Barcelona. I was talking to a movement that is targeting a company that runs a white phosphorus mine in Catalonia. It's polluting the environment there. And also this white phosphorus is used for bombs that are being deployed by Israel to kill Palestinian people. And the very cool insight that these activists had was that rather than just going and occupying this mine, they first contacted the unions, the workers of this mine. And that was a very successful tactic. They ended up having a very good dialogue with the workers who want to realize that what they're doing is they're servicing death and they want to do something else. They just don't feel like they have the conditions to do it. So now the activists are trying to help all these people to transition to something else, while also disrupting sort of the managers that are running the mine. Scientific narratives are often not very legible or relatable, and I think this is something that Scientist Rebellion has learned over time, and they've been changing the narrative over time. I think we started sort of just calling for vaguely climate action, or talking in a very scientific language like carbon parts per million, planetary tipping points, planetary boundaries, and I think that is not relatable. I mean, or legible if you're not a scientist. And I think we need to be better with our communication. We need to also be learning from the far right, who's very good at communicating with people emotionally and just directing their sources of stress to migrants. And instead of that, we obviously need to be directing it to the millionaires that are ruining our world. Talking about living costs, affordable public transport, free public transport, freeing the wealth, so we actually have all the well-being that we need in the rest of society. No one is coming to save us. I think obviously we need to be escalating and occupying more places. But I think whenever we do a protest, whenever we do an occupation, ideally we should also be prefiguring the world that we want to build. So just like those Palestine encampments, we need to couple all of our protests with generative action, showing people what it is that we want. So maybe the next occupation can involve an agroecological farm or a library of tools, something that is very visual and doesn't need a lot of explanation as to why we're doing what we're doing. Don't neglect politics as they are today. This is a bit of a contentious one. It's something that's been under debate in multiple SR chats. That's sort of building on the example of Mandani, like looking at sort of, whether party politics is also something that we need to be engaging better with rather than just ignoring it. Looking at movement parties. There's a very good book by Fabian Holtz on sort of following the Democratic Socialists of America over several years and how they operate kind of a little bit like a movement, but also a little bit like a party, and doing a lot more canvassing maybe beyond just focusing on things like direct action. At the same time, this might also not be the thing that everyone wants to do. There's a lot of arguments towards the other side of maybe going away from party politics and building dual power, building neighborhood assemblies that are independent of parties at a local level. But all of that involves a lot of canvassing. A lot of that involves a lot of knocking on doors. And I think regardless of what sort of which strategy we pursue there, I think we need to be knocking on a lot more doors in our workplaces and in our living spaces. I think this is something we can do in our universities, in our academic settings, the scientific and cultural work of creating the actual conditions for all the undoing that needs to happen, right? There's a lot of undoing of fossil structures that needs to happen very, very fast and ideally under safe conditions. We need to normalize the idea that we need to deconstruct coal mines. We need to deconstruct oil rigs. It's not just about, carbon capture and storage or like throwing some sort of aerosol into the air so we block the sun. I think there's much simpler things that we could be doing in terms of disassembling all these horrible structures that keep us in chains. That fall under sort of the umbrella of ex-innovation, the actual scientific and cultural work, but also engineering work and sociological work of undoing all the things that pollute our world and keep us in chains. Then adversarial research, this is something that was recommended by people like Julia Steinberger. All the people that are destroying our world, they have names, they have addresses, they have ways of communicating tactics and strategies, and they're kind of operating as social movements from above. And I think we could be doing a lot more research in academic settings to try to understand how they operate. So not just research on our social movements, but on the social movements that are fighting against climate action. And obviously also academic work to legitimize popular knowledge and struggles. So this is a bit less fancy than having a scientist in a lab coat being dragged by police from the street. But there's a lot of boring work, but also very useful work that academics can be doing to legitimize popular struggles. When some community is being affected by a corporation, they just might need an academic stamp or a scientific stamp to say, this is a legitimate demand, and these people need to be listened to. And so I think we have a lot of power in academia and in science to help local communities. Okay, that's the book. You can get it in major online retailers. There's bookshop.org, which supports local libraries. Try to avoid places like Amazon because they're horrible. And I want to thank all the scientist activists that I interviewed as part of this book. The book would not have happened without them. And I also want to thank my partner, Paula, not just for the support through writing the book, but also in this tour that I was in for 4 weeks. She was taking care of our kids alone. So she's been doing a lot of work, a lot more torturous work than what I've been doing traveling across all these countries. And I'll end with this quote by my favorite author, Ursula Le Guin. You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Fernando. Appreciate that amazing presentation. So much covered there, so much to dig into and to think about and to inspire all of us for more. We are at the end of our hour. However, I hope you will have time, Fernando, to answer some questions.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry that I went a little bit overboard. So yes,
It's
absolutely.
okay. It was an excellent presentation. There was so much good material there. We do have several questions in the chat, and for folks that have to go, this is being recorded and it will be available on the Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island YouTube page. So you can catch up to the Q&A there. But I'll encourage you, Fernando, I think there's probably at least 7 or 8 questions here. So
Yeah, happy to
so
go.
we'll be brief in your answers. Um, the so I'm let me I have to scroll back to the beginning, but while I do that, I'll take the MC prerogative and ask my question first, which is wondering if you have succeeded in making your activist work part of your day job, or do you have to do most of the work that you're doing and the publishing and so on that you're doing sort of in addition to your
Yeah.
position at the university? How has that worked for
Yeah,
you
I
personally?
think I think this is the like I mean even just saying activist work maybe is thorough detrimental because I mean like a lot of what we do should be our responsibility as scientists. You know, we are doing science dissemination, um, and I try as much as possible to like sort of consider all this work that I do as sort of part of my responsibility as a scientist as I work for a university. Um, and that also means, like, sort of, the fact that I wrote a book, it's an academic output. So I consider it an academic output and I consider it part of sort of my production as a scientist. This is something that I'm trying to incorporate, ideas like climate justice, like degrowth, like decolonial work, more and more into my job. So my background is in evolutionary genetics. It's very far from these topics. But increasingly, I'm doing research on degrowth, particularly degrowth in academia, and also teaching. This is something I talk about in my book. I'm teaching a course on degrowth and socio-ecological justice. Next year, I'll be teaching a course on social movement theory. So I'm trying slowly but surely trying to transition my work to things that are much more useful than studying genes over time.
Yeah. So I completely agree that this is valuable academic work. I wonder how your employer uh, feels
Well,
about that.
yeah, I mean they've been fairly supportive,
Oh, good.
and yes, I mean I think there's also like some privilege here. The fact that I'm first of all the fact that I'm a white male cisgender person, but also the fact that I have a permanent position, or at least
Mm.
as sort of as permanent as it gets in Denmark, which is not that permanent. There's been a round of firings recently in my university, but um, but I have some privilege, and I think this is also a responsibility for senior scientists. You know that we need to be showing the way. A lot of the people that are doing
Yeah.
quite a lot of risky things that I interviewed in the book. There are early career scientists that are much more precarious positions, and
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think I'm at the level of risk that some of the people in the book or some of the people in the movement in general are.
Yeah. Okay. Several of these questions came from people in the audience, but in the interest of time, I hope you all don't mind if I just read them for you. So Troy asks, what are your thoughts about the value of trying to start a rapid response action team, which is something we've been working on at SRTI? The focus would be to be able to respond to unnatural disasters as they occur. The goal would be as a resource to the media and the public
Mm,
about the science, being crystal clear about the fossil
mm.
fuel, culprit being largely responsible for climate breakdown.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that's a great idea. I mean, there's been increasingly like papers on this, like sort of adaptation as a form of mobilization, as a form of community organizing. Because I mean, all the things that like when I talk about community organizing, these things that sort of lead to communities being more resilient to climate disasters are also ways to empower communities to make them more aware of their own agency and also to help them disengage from fossil corporations, right? In Sweden, there's this group that called like Prepa Tillsammans, like prepping together. So it's about creating community as you're doing prepping for climate disasters, and also just being more aware also of like all the other crises that capitalism and colonialism
mm,
create that go beyond climate, like structural inequalities that also need to be addressed at the same time as we sort of prepare ourselves for increasing climate damage. So yeah, I think this
mm.
is a great idea, and this is something that also should be more widespread.
Yeah, thank you. And more, and also a sort of complement or augment the gaps in mainstream media about connecting these dots.
Absolutely.
Okay, Marion Grau asks, where do we go from here? Where do you see the future? SR is also affected by the post-COVID slump and a sense of futility, perhaps, question mark. What's your theory of change at this point or your theory of resistance?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
sort of in the present moment.
I don't want to espouse a single theory of change, but hopefully those reflections at the end sort of points to various future avenues. I
Yeah.
think I think the most important thing to me at this point, and this is just my personal thought is that like we need to sort of focus more on space, on the places in which we are, rather than just our identities. Bringing, I mean, just as I say, we need to meet people where they are in terms of sort of things like affordable public transport or like freeing the wealth, like when we talk to workers. I think remembering that academic scientists were also workers, we're also living under precarious conditions many times. Meeting people where they are in academia can just be, like reminding them that maybe they have a 1 year contract, they have a temporary contract, like they don't know what's going to happen after that. Um, Maybe this is something we've been discussing in our local groups, or like building worker councils, precarious councils in universities, to just have people talk to each other about the fact that academia in many ways sucks and could be other ways. And also, yeah, to so that we can think of these spaces. I mean, there's a lot of potential for transformation in universities and research, and there's also a lot of empty space that could be filled by civil society. Jenny Stephens in her book, she has this sort of analogy that universities should be more like public libraries that are sort of usable by the whole community, not just by people that have the right credentials. Um, so I think democratizing, decolonizing our universities, our spaces, and also looking beyond universities, looking beyond academic activism in general, in climate activism, maybe not frontlining climate as the thing that drives people, but just like the actual needs of people first. Climate can
Mm.
be maybe the fourth conversation you have with people, uh, and all the work that we need to be doing to sort of like dismantling the fossil economy, like decreasing the massive amounts of inequality that we have in our society, dismantling capitalism, bringing about free, like liberating all the wealth, things of affordable, free public transport, like universal basic services, universal basic income, like affordable hospitals, education, all these things um, are things that are also climate action. Maybe they're just like not first conceptualized as climate action when we're promoting these things, but like trying to figure out, like again, like how the far right they talk about basic needs and those basic needs not being met, and the reason why they're not being met is migrants or some racist response to that, right? But like realizing, yeah, I mean the first part of the, of that argument makes total sense. We just be directing it to the actual causes of this, which is the millionaires, the people that are running the economy and running us to an abyss at the same time.
Yeah, and so Jennifer's question is similar, and it was earlier in the talk. I think you've addressed it, this idea of how do we meaningfully reform academia. I think, at least in the United States, the idea of academia as kind of some kind of elite ivory tower
Mm.
is really working against us. So these ideas you
Mm.
have of really being relevant and meaningful to people in their lives rather than just,
Yeah.
supporting capitalism research and other things is, it would really not only make us more useful, but also probably more popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, yeah, if universities are seen less as elite institutions and more like sort of things that are in service of the community, then fascist attacks would be much easier to fight back, right? Because it would be the
Mm,
community that's defending the universities. In many ways, universities are also extractivist entities, right? They do extract a lot from the local places in which they are, and I think we need to come to terms with that and realize, well, maybe universities could also be different. It's not just about scientists going out and sort of like providing scientific information or even engaging in direct action, but it's also about like these places in which we operate. They're also very problematic and they need to be changed.
mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, switching topics a little bit, the a question from Scientist Rebellion New York City. One thing we often run into is how to measure efficacy of our actions. How would you measure this? In your opinion, do you think convincing everyone of climate change is enough to affect change?
Yeah, I guess those are two questions. I'll start with the first one, measuring efficacy. That's very hard. And often, I mean, we tend to fall into sort of these like scientific traps where we think that we just need to collect a lot of quantitative information in a narrowly defined way, and that's how we measure efficacy, and that sometimes is not very conducive to like figuring out what it is that we need to do, even though, obviously quantitative research is important, but it's not the only way in which we can learn about the world. Um, but I don't think it's just about climate change and like, I mean, I think a person can maybe understand climate change or know that climate change is happening and still not be activated and still not be not realizing that they're being screwed in many different ways. So again, I think climate should be the fourth sentence in the conversation. The first sentence should be about meeting people's basic needs. Actually, the first sentence should just not be us talking. It should be us listening, and then going from there. So. And I don't think it's just about information. I mean, just as we say in Science is Relevant, it's about power. It's also power also involves engaging in dialogue with the people with whom you're trying to build power. And that might not just be giving them lectures. It might just be listening to them first.
Hmm. Okay, Jeff Beeman asked a question about getting our message out there. He says, in the US, we've been getting less and less coverage in the press for protest events. Could be because of the outrageous actions of our president dominating the news cycle, could also be because of the decline of traditional news as a result of social media, few reporters and such. Uh, do you think there's a similar experience elsewhere? And how do we best get our message out now in the current climate, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, the media, that's a very good question. And I think initially, at least in Denmark and several countries in Europe, we used to think, more media coverage means more success of the actions. And I think even though media is an important factor, I don't think it's the only factor. And sometimes the media, we need to realize that the media is not on our side, and even though they might report on our action, they might not relay the message that we're trying to give, and they might just be trying to just create a theater out of action. So I think this model of sort of actions as theater that we sort of provide to the media, and the media then relays it, might be something that we need to be thinking a little bit about. So I think, yeah, coverage is good, but it shouldn't be the only factor in our actions. Sometimes this is something that it depends on the action and it depends on the local environment. And I cannot speak for what's happening in Turtle Island under sort of conditions of high authoritarianism, but I do think that this is a conversation needs to happen before any action. Is really media coverage what we want? Is it just to meet people, like discuss people that might be working in this particular place? Like that this mine in Catalonia was first about meeting with the people that were working there. It wasn't just the media was not even an afterthought. Um, and it might just be also like maybe we just want to disrupt some activity because that sort of like the disruption is the target rather than sort of the coverage of the disruption. So I think media is one factor, but I think we need to be careful that we don't make it the central factor. Also because the media is highly complicit in fossil
Mm,
capitalism and extractivism.
yeah, good point. Okay, Marion, again, this is talking about what the section of your talk where you talked about the Lutzi's, I think is how it's pronounced, the destruction of the town. And Marion says they've met a few scientists and activists who basically went into depression after that destruction, after the failure there, and have not yet found their way back into action
Mm.
again. And what do you think is, I guess, a way forward for
Yeah.
people, I guess, that through that experience? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was quite traumatic. I mean, that's sort of that's the midpoint in my book, and it's a very emotional event. And actually, in the tour that I was doing in the book, I also met several activists that were in Lutzeroth. I think to me, it showed two things. One of them is like, first of all, like even if you amass thousands of people, you should still consider the state as an adversarial actor. Like even with thousands of people storming a town, the town being destroyed, like an act of sort of colonialism within Europe, like with people not having a say over the destruction of this town. The state is there just to protect capital, right? Like they're not to protect the 35,000 people that are trying to prevent this town from being destroyed. They're just there to protect the few machines, the giant machines that are destroying the town. So the conception of the state as a protector of capital, I think this is a wake-up call for that came as a consequence of Lutzy. And of course, this is a realization that many people in the global south, in other places of resistance, have had for longer, but maybe it's something that we should be incorporating in struggles in the global north as well. And then the other thing is that maybe just storming a place is not enough. Sometimes it might be, but like beyond storming the place, we need to again like be building stronger ties with labor, like without the workers, without the people that are sort of enslaved to these companies due to salaries, like it's going to be very hard to dismantle this. So I think disruption is one component, but sort of alliances with labor should be another very big component that I think we're ignoring in the climate movement, or at least we're not paying it enough as much attention as we should be paying to sort of the confluence of labor demands and environmental demands.
Yeah, it reminds me of a different but perhaps similar thing in North America was the Standing Rock movement,
Mm.
and it ultimately sort of failed in terms of that the pipeline now runs under that river, under the Missouri River. However, the alliances and all the work that came out of that and has been
Mm.
pretty dramatic, I think. So,
And it also goes back to the question of like efficiency of actions. These actions have ripple effects. A lot of people
mm,
got trained from Lutzi and from a lot of these places of occupation and disruption that then go on to do their own things in their local places. So I think it's very hard to measure success with activism.
yeah.
I do think like we should be recognizing that, in many ways we are failing, our movements are failing. We're still, in a trajectory of climate disaster. At the same time, we have a lot of local victories, and every time that we sort of convince somebody to join a movement, that's a mini victory that we should also be celebrating, because
Mm,
it's one more person that is sort of standing in the way of the fossil machine.
mm. And exposing that, as you were just saying, that connection between the state actions and protecting the capitalist machine. This is not a question, but a comment from Barbara Harrison. We need to cross ethnic, class, and cultural boundaries and create relationships with people who are different from ourselves. Listen and bring them factual information. These include rural, low income, and communities of color.
Absolutely. I have no further addition to that. Yes, I entirely agree with that. Yeah.
And Barbara also mentions, for example, with the Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and the work that she's doing, which I note with her latest book and the new organization she's created, she's leaning more towards the activist side, which I think is an interesting development to watch in the US.
Dad, what is the new organization that she's created? Trying to
It's,
read service. I'm trying to finish up Serviceberry.
yeah,
Read the other book.
yeah,
I am go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm
it's
just so
okay.
excited to be with you.
It's okay. Her new book, Serviceberry, when you get to the end of it, you'll see that she actually advocates for pretty direct action tactics, and she's creating an organization called Plant Baby Plant.
Plant
So
baby
you
plant.
can look
I
that
think
up.
I think we need animal baby animal as well. But because you know what, I just have to say, I am currently researching, writing a book. And when I started reading Sweetgrass, I go, my God, we're on the same page. And the book is about animals, critically endangered animals rebelling against people.
Mm,
And and I haven't gotten chimpanzee is my main character. He's the leader because I figured, he's a primate. People could identify him. The ending will be a good one. But the point is, humans have got to become part of, not above, because not only are they destroying animal and plant habitats, they're destroying their own home. I mean, what does it take? Yeah, they may
yeah.
talk but you don't get it. You just don't get it. I think animals should be running the US. I mean, we've got to get it.
Maybe they already are. Uh, uh, Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's also like, I mean, it's also which humans are doing the destruction. In the book, I try to sort of disassemble this we that we often have with like, we are causing climate, like, and
Right.
I mean, also a lot of indigenous groups are actually resisting this, are trying to fight this. A lot of local people, like marginalized people, racialized peoples, and I think it's also about sort of maybe moving away from sort of this like homogenized humanity that is causing climate
You're
change.
absolutely right. This is, if you're not in the top, less than 1%, you're suffering. And that's why progressives, and I live in Ithaca, which is supposedly the bastion of progressivity, where Cornell University is. And I keep saying what I wrote in the chat, and it's like, we're not interested in your issue. Well,
Hmm.
guys, it's our responsibility to go and listen and bring facts to people. The commercial media, it doesn't do it, and it's owned more and more by fewer and fewer corporations. Oh, I
Thank
so
you, Barbara.
appreciate this conversation. Thank you for being patient with me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Appreciate your input. Okay, we do have a couple more. Let's keep moving. So, um, again, from scientists role in New York City, how do you think scientists can fit into mobilizing the general public? Maybe you feel like you've touched on that enough, but don't know if you have anything to add there, Fernando.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe going back to what I said before, like listening more than just trying to teach people. I mean, if the people that we're trying to mobilize are people that are being crushed, maybe not. Maybe it might not be climate disasters. It might be some other feature of capitalism that is crushing them. Maybe listening first to their needs and going from there. Also, I think even though we use the sort of the figure of the scientist a lot in scientist rebellion, like we wear the lab coat, we say we're scientists, we're the experts. Also, maybe learning some lessons on humility. There are many things that many ways of understanding the world in which we're in that are not part of the sort of dominant scientific Western scientific way of understanding the world, and we need to be respectful and listening to these other narratives that are very powerful and that are very helpful for understanding how we got to the point that we're in and how we can get out of it. I think just as I said, maybe we need to be transforming universities. We also need to be maybe deconstructing the figure of the scientist as sort of this elite figure that has the knowledge and is relaying the knowledge to those who should act on the knowledge, and sort of break maybe digging into what the scientist is. And once you dig in there, there's a lot of dark stuff about what scientists are and what scientific work is premised on, that we need to be sort of also critically exploring ourselves.
Yeah. I'll just do two last questions. A comment from Duretti when you were talking about alternate university models. She points out the Climate Justice Universities Union is
Yeah,
another resource.
they're awesome. I was in Ireland and I was meeting several people in the several of the studies that I showed in the slides are from people in the Climate Justice Universities Union. They're great, awesome people, and yeah, highly recommend checking them out and maybe like expanding to other chapters beyond Ireland. I mean, they're kind of an example of this sort of more place-based. They're
Yeah,
about the university rather than the figure of the scientist, which allows them to sort of like do things together with students, with staff, like people sort of relate more to the space rather than the figure of the scientist. And I think we should be looking at that. So yeah, maybe creating climate justice university unions or some form of radical university unions in other places would be great. I think this is one way in which we can also, I was talking about radicalizing our existing unions. I don't mean like creating all the bureaucratic structures of unions, because that might also be work, but just creating like radical unions that just are people that are calling out the unions for not doing the work that they should be doing is already quite powerful. Like sort of
mm,
people coming together and saying, look, these unions are not doing what they should be doing, and just pointing it out and saying we want this could also be a way to move the more mainstream unions to actually
yeah.
the collective work, sort of pushing for strikes, for general strikes, or following on the model of Italy with the genocide in Palestine. Like we need a lot more strikes. Uh, yeah, I think creating radical university unions would be a great first step.
Aguavita points out there's still a continuing indigenous protest protecting old growth forests in British Columbia today that
Nice.
are under attack from police. And Aguavita also says we need a revolution of the imagination. What does the future we want look like? And
Mm.
I think you've kind of, yeah, that
Yeah,
was,
a lot
go
of
ahead.
my last chapter in the book is about sort of imagining futures and from the perspective of scientists and academia, but also broadly. And I think we need to also like decolonize our heads and transform the ways we think about the problems that we're in. That's also very important work that we need to be doing internally, beyond the work that we do in our communities.
And then finally, do we want to touch on this? Nobody wants to think about the basic reason for all the trouble on this problem, growth of mankind. Should we ask for degrowth to be managed by the UN? And what do you,
No, I pretty much disagree with that, but I think that argument has been countered in the chat. I mean, degrowth is not about degrowing population; it's about degrowing the concentration of wealth, and so liberating the wealth in the top, so that we can actually satisfy the basic needs of people. We
and
can
do you think that
sustain all
definition?
the yeah.
Sorry.
But degrowth is not about population. That's not I mean, any basic book about degrowth is about degrowing the production and the consumption of our economies in a way that is democratic. It doesn't involve any kind of sort
Right.
of like birth control.
So
I think it's a very dangerous argument to sort of talk about population control that we shouldn't be getting. Like I think that's something we should be counteracting for sure.
Thank you. I agree with that. I was wondering if our other definition of degrowth, which is controlling the capitalism and the consumerism and so on, if that's something you feel like could exist at the level of the UN for,
Yeah, but also I don't know, like the UN is not even able to stop a genocide right now. So like, or multiple genocides in Sudan and Congo as well as in Palestine, right? So like beyond like these supranational structures, I think a lot of the work that we need to be doing is locally in our
local.
neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the
I mean,
COP is
obviously,
another example. Yeah.
yeah, if we can push for degrowth at supranational or national level, great. But I mean, I think a lot of the work that needs to happen is going to happen at a more municipal and local level. And again, there's a recent paper. You might not want to call them like degrowth, as it's just like having good lives, like being able to live where we are, being able to source our food, afford our food, like the very basic things. Having like conversations about like why do I pay like 30 euros to commute? Why is the public train not free? Like and why is that an oil company being subsidized by the government as I struggle to just get to my work, right? So these very basic things that we don't need to call them degrowth. Like degrowth is a very useful word as a missile world, but a lot of things that people are behind these things. If you just have the conversation about what degrowth really involves, which is just liberating the wealth from the top.
Yeah. Okay. Closing comment from Greg Spooner. It does seem like humility for scientists is a theme here.
Absolutely.
So something for all of us to consider. And I think with that, we're at a full hour and a half and we will wrap it up. Thanks everybody for staying on. And again, thank you, Fernando, for a really interesting and inspiring
Thank you so
presentation.
much for
Appreciate
having
it.
me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you so very much. It's been a
Thank you.
very stimulating hour for me. A positive hour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.